Your life is a rather finite thing. You will live and die having occupied a limited space for a limited amount of time. But all the same, we seem to sense there's something infinite out there to grab hold of. And that's what we're going to talk about on today's installment of Authentic. When I was a kid back in the 3rd grade, my friends and I were very impressed with very large numbers. What's the biggest number you can think of, someone would say, and then somebody else with a knowing look would mention the number Google. Not the search engine, obviously, because this is years before public internet. It was Google the number. And of course, one of the other kids would then whisper with a note of reverence, "Man, just how big is Google?" "It's one with 100 zeros," somebody would say, and we were all very proud that we were capable of contemplating such a massive number. But of course, none of us were actually capable of comprehending it, because where in the world would you ever use a number that big? The most common large numbers we use today have 6, 9, or 12 zeros behind them, or in other words, millions, billions, and trillions. We measure national budgets and debts in terms of trillions. We measure the universe in terms of hundreds of billions of galaxies or hundreds of billions of stars. And sadly, in some places, we now measure the cost of real estate in terms of millions. There's just no conceivable situation where you'd need a number with 100 zeros behind it. I mean, let's just go back to the subject of astronomy for a moment and ask ourselves, if you have 100 billion galaxies with 100 billion stars in each one of them, exactly how many stars would that be? Well, that would be a 1 with 22 zeros behind it, or 100 quintillion, which is nowhere near the value of a Google. So in reality, a Google might sound impressive, but there's no practical use for a number that large. The word was actually invented by a 9-year-old kid back in 1920, the nephew of a well-known mathematician, which might be why 3rd graders are so duly impressed by it. So, we do have to admit, Google is very useful for dazzling your friends on the playground, but in more practical terms, we really have no way to use it. One author I was reading put it like this: if you filled our observable universe with sand, and I mean packed it really tightly, you would have to do that 100,000 times over to come up with a Google's worth of sand particles. So, yeah, a Google is very, very large. But then, of course, back in the 1970s, somebody else on the playground would then try to outsmart the rest of us by bringing up something indisputable. An infinity is much, much bigger than Google because, of course, infinity has no upper limit. You could start counting today and you would never reach the end of infinity, even if you kept on counting, well, forever. Now, of course, if a Google doesn't have a practical application, then you'd think that infinity would be even less useful. But that's not actually the case. In fact, it's a number we use quite often because infinite things actually happen in the world of math. When we calculate the value of pi, for example, that ever-useful number that helps us measure circles and globes, what you get is an endless string of numbers behind the decimal point. It's an irrational number, which means that you can't express it neatly as a fraction, even though most of us were taught that 22 over 7 is a close estimate. Pi, as you know, is the circumference of a circle divided by its diameter, and that produces a series of digits after the decimal point that never repeats itself and never ends. It just goes on and on and on, forever with no end in sight. Now, practically speaking, stopping at 3.14 is close enough for most of the math that most people do. So there's no need for most of us to deal with an infinite string of decimals. So, just how big is an infinity? Well, by definition, it doesn't have a size because it's boundless. You're never going to reach the end of it. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. And that's a concept that can lead to some rather problematic math questions. For example, what do you get if you add infinity to infinity? Well, the answer is still infinity because the sum is still a number that goes on forever. So what you really get is an equation that kind of looks like this. Infinity plus infinity equals infinity. Now the problem with that is that you can subtract infinity from both sides of the equation, which leaves you with a statement that says infinity equals 0, and we know that can't be right. Or you could rewrite the equation to say 2 times infinity equals infinity, and if you divide both sides of that equation by 2, you get infinity equals half of infinity. Which sort of makes sense, I guess, because if you don't know where the end of infinity is, there's no way to figure out where the halfway point is. But then again, adding infinity to infinity seems like a silly exercise to begin with because really, practically speaking, you have to know the total value of something in order to add it to something else. The only way you can add 4 plus 3, for example, is to pick up counting 3 more places after you get to 4, which takes you to the answer 7. But when you're adding something to infinity, there's really no starting place where you can add your next number, which means that you can't even add 1 to infinity. So in reality, infinity is just a mathematical concept, a useful tool when you're doing complex calculations. But still, there is a sense in which the number infinity enters our everyday understanding of the world. Back in 1576, a guy by the name of Thomas Digges proposed that the universe has no outer limit. It just continues on in every direction forever. In other words, if you get in a spaceship and start traveling in a straight line, you will keep on traveling forever without ever coming back to the starting point. Then in 1584, the notable philosopher Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake, suggested that there was absolutely no limit to the universe. There was an infinite number of stars with an infinite number of planets, which of course meant that there were infinite possibilities for life to emerge all across the universe. Mr. Bruno said, innumerable suns exist. Innumerable Earths revolve around these suns in a manner similar to the way the 7 planets revolve around our sun. Living beings inhabit these worlds. Now that's an exciting concept, the idea that the universe simply goes on forever in any given direction. But it's also a concept that makes us feel incredibly small and insignificant. I mean, who do we think we are? There might just be a vastly superior civilization somewhere out there beyond the stars, but we will never know about them, and they will never make contact because they live an infinite distance from our planet. And I know, that's hard to wrap your head around because reason demands real numbers in measurable spaces. But if the universe is infinite, then there's always going to be something or somebody who's further away than our most recent, furthest reaching measurement. Of course, not all scientists are convinced that the universe actually goes on forever. What if space is actually curved, kind of like the surface of our planet? Here on Earth, I can travel in a straight line going in one direction forever, but what I'm doing is circling the globe and coming back to my starting point. So while there are no actual boundaries to the surface of our world, it isn't really an infinite space. So what if the universe kind of looks like that? What if you get in a spaceship and travel in a single direction for a really long time and end up exactly where you started? Or what if the universe is flat, but it kind of works like one of those old original Pac-Man games, where if you wander off the edge of the screen, you simply reappear on the other side of the screen, traveling in the same direction as when you left. I mean, anything is possible because we still have no idea exactly what's out there. And now I've got to take a break because apparently my time on this show is not infinite. So I'll be right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
For about half a millennium now, the human race has been toying with the idea that the universe we live in is infinite. It just goes on in every direction forever. Of course, if that's true, it's hard to imagine how useful that information would be. I mean, I guess it could keep us from launching foolish expeditions to find the edge of the universe. But beyond that, I'm not exactly sure how practical the knowledge of an infinite universe would be. But then let's suppose that the universe is actually finite, that it has a definite edge and a definite boundary, and it's all contained in a given space. Well, then you've got to wonder exactly where that's located. Where would our limited universe be housed? And what would you find next door if you could poke through the wall and keep on traveling? Another universe? And if that was true, how many more universes could you expect to find? An infinite number? Or maybe leaving the universe is just impossible because by its very definition, the universe is all there is. But then again, I'm left wondering where in the world that one and only universe would reside. I mean, I suppose the answer is nowhere in particular because things like space and time only exist inside the universe and not outside, which would mean that while things inside the universe have a location, things on the outside wouldn't. And of course, the idea that there's an outside of any kind out there becomes utterly nonsensical. It's all very mind-bending. It's kind of like when mathematicians talk about higher dimensions. In our everyday world, there are only four: 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. So in other words, in order for us to perceive that an object exists, it has to have width, height, and depth. And then it has to exist for a given amount of time in order to be real. So that's 4 dimensions. But then some egghead with an advanced degree in math and physics assures us that there's a 5th and a 6th and a 7th dimension because the math, they say, is there. But try to visualize where a 5th dimension is and you run into trouble. It's a concept that exists quite outside of everyday reality. So people who try to illustrate such things will often draw what's called a hypercube. But in order to draw a hypercube, you have no choice but to create a 3-dimensional diagram. Well, actually, that's not true, because if you're drawing it on paper, it's really just a 2-dimensional drawing meant to help you visualize something that exists in more than 2 dimensions. We do the same thing when we draw a 3-dimensional cube. The drawing is only 2 dimensions, but we can easily imagine 3 because that represents the real world we live in. A 5th dimension, however, does not. That's really hard to conceptualize. You might as well try to describe a brand new primary color that nobody has ever seen. We simply don't have the mental capacity to visualize something like that. And if your brain is starting to hurt right about now, just bear with me for a few more minutes because I'm actually going somewhere with this. When you ask most Christians about God, they're going to tell you that He's infinite. He has unlimited power or omnipotence. He has unlimited knowledge, which means He's omniscient. And of course, He's not constrained by spatial limitations because He created space in the first place, which means that God can be omnipresent, existing everywhere, all at the same time. Now, that's not quite the same thing as something called pantheism, which suggests that God is His creation, that the physical world is just a manifestation of His presence. That's an idea that has wormed its way into Christian thought from time to time, but it doesn't agree with the Bible, which tells us that the Creator is quite distinct from His creation. God is more like the master painters of the Renaissance. You can find their mark on the paintings they created, and their art is clearly a representation of who they were, to the point where experts can tell who the artist was just by studying style. But it would be silly to suggest that the painting is the painter. That doesn't make sense. In reality, this is one of the major flaws I find in the line of reasoning that some modern atheists produce in an effort to discount the existence of God. When Christians argue that God must be real because the universe appears to be designed, and of course, a design suggests a designer, some skeptics will sneer and say, well then who made God? As if they've driven a final nail into the design argument. You find that kind of thinking in Richard Dawkins' famous book, The God Delusion, where he tries to dismantle the argument from design by saying this: design is the only alternative to chance that the authors can imagine. Therefore, a designer must have done it. And science's answer to this faulty logic is also always the same. Design is not the only alternative to chance. natural selection is a better alternative. Indeed, design is not a real alternative at all because it raises an even bigger problem than it solves. Who designed the designer? That's a rather disingenuous question because he's equating designs and designers, which are not the same thing. I mean, you could also ask the question, who created this painting? And somebody else will answer it was Picasso. But then if you ask, well, who painted Picasso? Well, now you're talking nonsense because he's a painter, not a painting. And the same thing holds true for God. He's not at all the same as his creation because he's a creator. Who created the creator is a foolish question because the answer is nobody. He wasn't created. But now I'm wandering off track. So let's return to the notion of an infinite God whose existence does not depend on anything else. You and me? Our existence is contingent. It relies on something. For starters, we're the product of our parents' DNA, and we rely on a continued input of nutrients in order to sustain our existence. If the planet we inhabit didn't have the elements necessary to keep us breathing, we would cease to exist. We rely on oxygen, and sunlight, and sugar, and 1,000 other things in order to exist. But God is underived. He doesn't rely on anything else or anybody else for his existence. So when we try to understand him in terms of our own experience, well, if we're not careful, we can start to get nonsensical answers, just like you do when you try to add infinity to infinity and then solve for infinity. You're defining the infinite in terms of the finite, and that's never going to give you a satisfactory result. Great is the Lord, the psalmist wrote, and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. What we have in the Bible is a God who is both knowable and unknowable at the same time. He's knowable because he reveals himself to us in the pages of Revelation and through the person of his Son, who became a human being in order to identify with us. He who has seen me, Jesus said, has seen the Father. And of course, then we have one of my all-time favorite quotes from Jeremiah chapter 9, which you've heard me read about 100 times before. It says, "But let him who glories glory in this, that he understands and knows me." So on the one hand, God is knowable, and that's because he's made the effort to intersect with our finite temporal world. But at the same time, he's beyond that, which means there are things about God that we will never be able to fully understand. I'm reminded of that passage over in 1 Timothy chapter 6, where Paul describes Christ as, quote, "the blessed and only potentate, the King of kings and Lord of lords, who alone has immortality, dwelling in unapproachable light, whom no man has seen or can see, to whom be honor and everlasting power." Now, I know there are people who will say that the idea of an infinite, eternal God is some kind of cop-out, a clever workaround to explain things about the Christian faith that are nearly impossible to understand in a strictly logical fashion. When you can't really explain something rationally, then you just declare it a mystery and move on. Can't understand how God can be one God and three persons at the same time? Just call it a mystery. Can't understand how God spoke the universe into existence? Another mystery. And it kind of sounds like the critics have a valid criticism, except for one little detail. If there really is an infinite, eternal God, if that's true, but we could explain everything about him in perfect detail, that would mean he isn't an infinite, eternal God. And if you think about it, it's not really a cop-out. It's exactly what you'd expect if the Bible is telling the truth. And now I've got to take a really quick break, but it's not going to be an infinite break, so sit tight, and I'll be right back after this.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
Saul of Tarsus was indisputably one of the brightest minds of the first century. Not only did he study at the feet of Gamaliel, one of the greatest teachers of the ancient world, but he also produced the bulk of the New Testament by writing letters that were so dense with systematic and profound theology that scholars continue to marvel over these writings even now. And in the book of Romans, which many consider to be Paul's masterpiece, he made this statement about the nature of God. He said, "Oh, the depths of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has become his counselor? Or who has first given to him, and it shall be repaid to him? For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever." Now, Paul was quoting from the Old Testament using passages from Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the book of Job. And in the book of Job, we find a statement about God's creative power where it says, "Indeed, these are the mere edges of his ways, and how small a whisper we hear of him. But the thunder of his power, who can understand?" So again, if God is real, and the universe really owes its existence to him, then you'd have to expect that we're not going to know everything that God knows. We're not going to be able to wrap our finite minds all the way around his infinite existence. And yeah, that can be frustrating because, as one trashy tabloid used to say, inquiring minds want to know. But then on the other hand, I also kind of find it exhilarating because I've been studying the mind and character of God as they're portrayed in this book for decades. And I know I've barely scratched the surface. It's a subject that I'm never going to exhaust because no matter how long I live, I'm dealing with eternity and I'll not get to the end of it. I mean, just think about your college courses, especially if you were a liberal arts major like me. And just think about how boring and redundant those courses can be. After a while, I'll admit it, I just quit going to class because I realized that the professors had nearly exhausted the subject and there was so much overlap between classes that I could basically fake my term papers by blending ideas from other classes and rebranding them for my current class. There comes a point with human knowledge where you say to yourself, is that it? That's all there is? I mean, go and ask a doctoral candidate what they think of their specialty when they're finished writing their thesis. And a lot of them will tell you they never want to see the subject again as long as they live. And that's the way it is with ordinary, everyday knowledge. You almost always reach a saturation point where there's not much more you can learn. But if the infinite God is real, and He's made an effort to communicate with us, then I would suggest that you're never going to hit a saturation point. You're never going to come to a moment when you feel like you've hit the end of the subject. You know, I've been reading this book now for decades, and every time I open it, I learn something new about this infinite God to whom I'm indebted for my very existence. Every time I think I've mastered some aspect of God's character, I discover that I've barely gotten started. The pursuit of God is different from every other pursuit because it takes you to the most important questions in the universe. Who are you? And what does it mean to live an authentic human life? What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Why do we have to suffer if God is really good? And how can we know if our knowledge is accurate? That we actually understand things? Look, I've been reading the major works of philosophy ever since I was a kid, and I have a deep appreciation for some of the brilliant minds who produced all these profound, written works of art. They've brought me a lot of enjoyment. But with all of them, I eventually come to a point where I'm forced to ask, is that it? Is that really all they have to say on that subject? It's especially bad when they fail to come up with meaningful answers. They ask a lot of meaningful questions, but it's not very often that they come to meaningful conclusions. However, with the Bible, it's different. This is the product of an infinite mind, a mind that came up with us. And so you're never going to hit the bottom of it. For example, just when you think you're beginning to understand what love is, you find a more profound expression of love in the pages of this book. When you think you've finally figured out what justice means and how to build a just society, you'll find your ideas being torn to shreds by the one who invented justice and righteousness in the first place. Just when you think you know what it means to live a human life authentically, you suddenly find the story of a man who has captured the collective imagination of this planet for 2,000 years because his human life simply towers above ours. And we get this sense that he's showing us what human life was supposed to look like. All right, I've got to take another quick break, but I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Infinity is a massive number, a number without limit, and it's fun to think about infinity when you're doing math. It's fun to think about a beam of light launching into space and traveling in a straight line forever, continuing to move in one direction long after you died. There's just something fascinating about the concept of eternity. And sure enough, when you turn to the pages of the Bible, you discover that God planned it that way. He says in Ecclesiastes 3:11, He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, He has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. Let me suggest that when we're reading the works of human philosophers, we find incredibly useful ideas because those people were really intelligent. But when you open the Bible, you find the ideas of the philosophers are really the shallow end of the pool when compared to the ideas that emerge from the heart and mind of God. There's just something about the Bible that really speaks to the heart, that satisfies our hunger to know things. If this book really is the voice of an infinite God trying to communicate with us, that would mean it's probably worth your time to really investigate it, carefully, honestly, prayerfully. Because maybe, just maybe, the God who inspired this book is bigger than the questions you've had all your life. You know, that same chapter in the book of Ecclesiastes says, I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing taken from it. God does it that men should fear before Him. Thank you for listening. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been another episode of Authentic.